New York City in winter. The holiday season. Fifth Avenue glows with lights strung between limestone facades. The storefronts of Cartier and Tiffany display diamonds that cost more than most people earn in a lifetime. Black cars idle outside the Pierre, the Plaza, the Peninsula. Doormen in long coats opening doors for women draped in fur and men in bespoke suits. The galas are in full swing. Charity auctions where a single paddle raised can fund a hospital wing. New Year's Eve parties where the champagne flows until dawn and the guest list reads like a Forbes index. This is the world of old money and new fortunes, of penthouses with Central Park views and townhouses passed down through generations. A world where wealth is both armor and inheritance, where the right last name opens every door, where security is measured in lawyers and offshore accounts. But here's what the velvet ropes and private elevators can't protect you from. Violence doesn't care about your portfolio. Murder doesn't check your pedigree before it strikes. And sometimes, often actually, wealth doesn't shield you from danger. It invites it. It creates it. It becomes the very reason someone wants you dead. Tonight, we're walking through 7 cases that prove money can't buy safety. From the most audacious hotel heist in American history to a socialite who murdered her own child in a luxury suite. From a hedge fund titan killed by his Ivy League son over an allowance to an heiress who spent 28 years in a coma while the world debated whether her husband tried to murder. These aren't crimes of desperation or poverty. These are crimes born from entitlement, greed, rage, and the toxic belief that wealth makes you untouchable. This is plain sight, docs. And these are 7 crimes that prove the penthouses of New York aren't palaces. They're crime scenes waiting to happen. The Heist at the Pierre. January 2nd, 1972. The Pierre Hotel, 5th Avenue and 61st Street. If you wanted to rob the wealthiest people in America, you couldn't pick a better target than the Pierre on the morning after New Year's Eve. The hotel was, and remains, one of the most prestigious addresses in Manhattan, the kind of place where European royalty stays, where oil magnates keep permanent suites, where old money goes to be among other old money without the inconvenience of mingling with anyone who works for a living. The guest registry read like a directory of American wealth. Industrialists, society matrons with jewelry collections that belonged in museums, businessmen whose companies had built half the infrastructure of the modern world. And all of them, on January 2nd, 1972, were sleeping off hangovers from New Year's Eve celebrations that had lasted until the early morning hours. The hotel's security reflected its clientele's expectations. It was discreet. Wealthy people don't like to be reminded they need protection, but supposedly sophisticated. The lobby was staffed 24 hours. There were security protocols for accessing the upper floors. And most importantly, there was the vault. The Pierre maintained an extensive system of safety deposit boxes for its guests and permanent residents. Diamonds, cash, securities. The kind of portable wealth that people don't trust to home safes or bank vaults, preferring instead the convenience of keeping its steps from their hotel rooms. The security around those boxes was significant. The vault was in the basement, accessible only through locked doors. The boxes themselves required 2 keys, one held by the hotel, one by the guest. The system was designed to be impregnable. It wasn't. At approximately 4 a.m. on January 2nd, a group of men entered the Pierre Hotel. They weren't wearing ski masks or carrying visible weapons. They were dressed in tuxedos, expensive, well-tailored evening wear that made them indistinguishable from the guests who had been coming and going all night from various New Year's parties. They walked through the front entrance like they belonged there, like they were residents returning from celebrations. The overnight desk clerk barely glanced at them. And then, once they were inside and the lobby was relatively empty, everything changed. Guns came out. Not brandished wildly, but produced calmly, professionally, held in ways that made it clear these men knew exactly how to use them. The leader of the group, later identified as Bobby Comfort, a career criminal with a history of sophisticated robberies, took control of the situation with remarkable efficiency. The overnight staff were rounded up quickly and quietly. No shouting, No violence, just calm. Clear instructions delivered in a tone that made it obvious that compliance was the only smart option. The thieves zip-tied the staff's hands and moved them to a secure location where they couldn't trigger any alarms. Then they went to work. The heist wasn't a smash and grab. It wasn't frantic or chaotic. It was methodical, almost leisurely in its execution, like a team of professionals who had all the time in the world and knew exactly what they were doing. They had keys to access the vault area. Whether obtained through an inside man or copied from stolen originals was never definitively established. They had tools, specifically a high-powered drill capable of defeating the locks on the safety deposit boxes. And they had a plan. For the next several hours, while the hotel's wealthy guests slept upstairs in their $1,000-a-night suites, the thieves systematically looted the vault. They drilled into box after box, extracting jewelry, cash, bearer bonds, and other valuables. They worked with the calm focus of people who had rehearsed every step, who knew exactly how long they had and what they needed to do. The contrast between their actions and their demeanor was surreal. They were polite, almost absurdly so. When they encountered hotel staff, or the occasional guest wandering down at an unfortunate moment, they addressed them as sir and madam. They apologized for the inconvenience. They assured people that no one would be hurt if everyone remained calm and cooperative. And then they continued robbing them blind. The drill whined in the basement. Metal shrieked as locks gave way. And slowly, methodically, millions of dollars in valuables were transferred from the safety deposit boxes into bags the thieves had brought for exactly that purpose. By the time the sun came up on January 2nd, the thieves were gone. They walked out the same way they'd come in, through the front door, carrying bags that looked like luggage, still dressed in their tuxedos, looking for all the world like guests checking out after an extended New Year's celebration. The staff they'd restrained were found shortly after, and the alarm was raised. But the thieves had hours of head start, vanishing into the city before the NYPD even knew a crime had occurred. The scope of the robbery became clear as the day progressed and guests began checking their safety deposit boxes. The losses were staggering. Conservative estimates put the total haul at around 10 million, though some sources suggest it could have been significantly higher, as not all victims reported their losses for tax reasons or because the jewelry was, let's say, not entirely legal in origin. Adjusted for inflation, that's well over $60 million in today's currency. It was the largest hotel robbery in American history, a record that still stands decades later. Then an NYPD investigation was massive and immediate. The Pierre Heist was an embarrassment, not just a crime, but a very public demonstration that even the wealthiest, most secure locations in New York weren't safe. The pressure to solve the case was enormous, coming from the hotel ownership, from the victims, many of whom had significant political connections, and from the media, which was having a field day with the story of tuxedo thieves robbing millionaire. Detectives quickly determined that this wasn't the work of amateurs. The level of planning, the inside knowledge of the hotel's layout and security procedures, the professionalism of the execution, it all pointed to experienced criminals, probably career thieves with connections to organized crime. The investigation focused on known associates of Bobby Comfort, whose name came up repeatedly in the criminal underworld as someone who specialized in exactly this kind of sophisticated robbery. Comfort was a legend in certain circles, a thief who planned jobs with obsessive attention to detail, who never resorted to unnecessary violence, who believed that the best robberies were the ones where nobody got hurt, and the thieves were long gone before anyone realized they'd been robbed. Over the following months and years, the NYPD and FBI built their case. They identified the members of Comfort's crew through informants, surveillance, and good old-fashioned detective work. They tracked down some of the stolen jewelry through fences and pawn shops. They followed the money as it flowed through the criminal economy. Eventually, arrests were made. Bobby Comfort and several of his associates were charged with the Pierre Heist. The evidence was substantial: testimony from informants, physical evidence connecting them to the robbery, financial records showing unexplained wealth appearing right after the heist. But here's where the story takes a turn that frustrated investigators and prosecutors. Very little of the stolen property was ever recovered. Some jewelry turned up over the years, sold through various channels, traced back through complicated chains of transactions. But the vast majority of the $10 million in valuables simply vanished, presumably distributed through criminal networks, melted down, or hidden so effectively that it was never found. Bobby Comfort and his crew went to prison. Justice, in the legal sense, was served. But the people who had been robbed, the society matrons and industrialists and old money families, the diamonds and cash and securities were gone, absorbed into the underworld economy, transformed and redistributed in ways that made recovery impossible. The Pierre Hotel itself faced a reckoning. How had this happened? How had a group of thieves walked into one of the most prestigious hotels in the world and spent hours looting it without being detected until it was too late? The answer was a combination of factors. Overconfidence in existing security measures, understaffing during the overnight hours when wealthy guests didn't want to see too much security presence, and critically, an inside man, someone with access to the hotel's security procedures and vault protocols who had provided Comfort with the information he needed to plan the job. That inside man was never definitively identified in public records, though the investigation strongly suggested someone on the hotel staff had been compromised, either through bribery or blackmail. The hotel upgraded its security dramatically after the heist, installing systems that would prevent a repeat performance. But the damage to its reputation was significant. For years afterward, remember, the Pierre was a dark joke among New York's elite, a reminder that even the thickest walls and most expensive security couldn't guarantee safety. What makes the Pierre heist particularly fascinating from a criminal psychology perspective is the contrast between the violence of the crime and the manner of its execution. Make no mistake, this was a violent crime. The staff and guests were terrorized. They were held at gunpoint, restrained, threatened with death if they didn't cooperate. The psychological trauma was real and lasting, but the execution was remarkably non-violent in practice. No one was physically harmed. No one was beaten or shot. The thieves maintained control through the credible threat of violence, rather than its application. They were professionals who understood that unnecessary violence complicates robberies, creates witnesses who are motivated by revenge rather than just fear, and dramatically increases the penalties if you're caught. Bobby Comfort and his crew were criminals, serious, career criminals who deserved the prison sentences they received. But they were also, in their own twisted way, craftsmen. They planned meticulously. They executed with precision. They minimized risk and chaos. They treated robbery as a profession requiring skill and discipline rather than just desperation and violence. There's a tendency to romanticize heists like the Pierre robbery, to see them through the lens of Hollywood movies where charming thieves outsmart incompetent security and steal from people who can afford the loss. And certainly, the story has elements that lend themselves to that interpretation. The tuxedos, the politeness, the sheer audacity of walking into one of New York's most prestigious hotels and robbing it blind. But the reality is less romantic. Real people were terrorized. Real wealth that represented lifetimes of work for some of the victims, or family heirlooms with irreplaceable sentimental value, was stolen and never recovered. And while the thieves may have been professional in their execution, they were still criminals engaged in serious felonies that traumatized their victims. The Pierre heist stands as a reminder that security is only as strong as its weakest point. That inside information can defeat almost any protective measure. That wealth creates targets. And that sometimes the greatest threat comes not from desperate criminals breaking in through windows, but from professional thieves walking in through the front door in tuxedos, looking like they belong. The hotel still stands on Fifth Avenue, still hosts the wealthy and powerful, still maintains safety deposit boxes for guests who want secure storage for their valuables. But anyone who stores something valuable there knows the story, knows that on a January morning in 1972, professionals walked in and demonstrated that nothing is truly secure if someone wants it badly enough and plans carefully enough. Bobby Comfort died in prison years later, never revealing where the bulk of the stolen property ended up. His crew members, those who survived incarceration, maintained the code of silence that professional criminals live by. Somewhere, in safety deposit boxes, or private collections, or long-forgotten hiding places, millions of dollars in jewelry from the Pierre heist still exist. Diamonds don't decompose. Gold doesn't decay. Those valuables are out there, somewhere, a permanent reminder of the largest hotel robbery in American history. And every January 2nd, someone at the Pierre probably remembers. Probably walks through the lobby and imagines men in tuxedos with guns, drilling into vault boxes while millionaires slept upstairs. The morning after New Year's Eve, when everyone was too hungover to notice that thieves were stealing their fortunes. The Ivy League patricide. January 4th, 2015. Beekman Place, Manhattan. Beekman Place is one of those New York addresses that most people have never heard of. And that's exactly the point. It's a quiet, tree-lined enclave in the Turtle Bay neighborhood, a 2-block cul-de-sac that dead ends at the East River. There are no shops, no restaurants, no through traffic. Just elegant pre-war apartment buildings and a handful of townhouses occupied by people who value privacy and can afford to pay for it. It's old money, quiet wealth, the kind of place where UN ambassadors and retired CEOs and multi-generational trust fund families live in apartments that have been in the same family for decades, where your net worth is assumed rather than discussed, where everyone knows everyone, but interaction is limited to polite nods in the elevator. Thomas Gilbert Sr. lived on Beekman Place with his wife, Shelley. He was 70 years old, a Harvard-educated hedge fund manager who had built a successful career in finance, not a household name, but well-respected in the industry. The kind of man who had spent his life making smart investments, managing risk, building wealth steadily and sustainably. He had everything that American success is supposed to look like. The prestigious address, the financial security, the beautiful wife, the Ivy League-educated son who should have been positioned to continue the family's upward trajectory. Except his son, Thomas Gilbert Jr., wasn't continuing anything. He was unraveling. Tommy, as he was known to the family, was 30 years old in January 2015. On paper, his life looked perfect. Princeton graduate. Tall, handsome, athletic. He'd been a champion athlete in prep school, connected to all the right social circles. A regular fixture in the Hamptons during summer seasons, photographed at parties with other sons and daughters of New York's elite. But beneath the surface, Tommy's life was a carefully maintained facade, barely concealing complete dysfunction. He had never held a steady job. Not for lack of opportunity. His father's connections could have opened doors anywhere in finance, but because he couldn't or wouldn't commit to the mundane reality of actual work, he drifted between half-hearted attempts at starting businesses, ventures that existed more as concepts than functioning enterprises. A surf apparel company that never actually sold anything. Investment ideas that never materialized into actual funds. He lived on an allowance from his father. At 30 years old, Princeton educated, supposedly an adult, he was still receiving monthly payments like a teenager with a paper route. And the allowance was substantial. Thousands of dollars a month, enough to maintain an apartment in Manhattan, to continue his social life, to keep up appearances with his Hamptons set friends, who probably assumed he was independently wealthy. But it wasn't enough. It's never enough for people like Tommy, people whose sense of entitlement has expanded to fill whatever space their wealth creates. The more his father gave him, the more he needed. The more he needed, the angrier he became when his needs weren't instantly met. The relationship between father and son had deteriorated over years. Thomas Sr. was increasingly frustrated with his son's lack of direction, his refusal to build an independent life, his continued dependence well past the age when most young men have established careers. He wanted Tommy to grow up, to take responsibility, to become self-sufficient. Tommy wanted his father to keep funding his lifestyle without questions or conditions. The conflict came to a head in late 2014 and early 2015. Thomas Sr., finally reaching the end of his patience, told his son that the allowance was being reduced. Not eliminated. Even in his frustration, Thomas Sr. wasn't cutting his son off entirely, but reduced. The new amount would be $300 a month less than what Tommy had been receiving. $200 per week. That's what this story comes down to. That's the difference between a functioning relationship and murder. For most people, a $300 monthly reduction would be an inconvenience, maybe a reason to adjust spending slightly. For Tommy, with his sense of entitlement and his fury at being controlled, it was an unforgivable betrayal. On Sunday, January 4th, 2015, Tommy went to his parents' apartment on Beekman Place. He had a key. He was family, after all. He let himself in around 3:30 p.m. His mother, Shelley, was there. His father was in the bedroom, perhaps reading or working. Tommy asked his mother to go get him a sandwich. The request was specific. He wanted food from a particular deli a few blocks away. It would take her maybe 15-20 minutes to walk there and back. Shelley, probably not thinking anything of it. Mothers do these things for their adult children, especially when those children have been pampered their entire lives, put on her coat and left. Tommy walked into his father's bedroom. What happened next is based on forensic evidence and Tommy's own confused, contradictory statements afterward, because there were no other witnesses. Tommy pulled out a .40 caliber Glock handgun. Where he'd obtained it isn't entirely clear from public records. New York has strict gun laws, and Tommy didn't have a permit. He'd either purchased it illegally or borrowed it from someone. He pointed it at his father. Thomas Gilbert Sr., 70 years old, sitting in his own bedroom in one of the safest neighborhoods in Manhattan, looked up to see his son pointing a gun at him. We'll never know what he said or thought in those final moments. Whether he tried to reason with Tommy, whether he pleaded, whether he understood what was about to happen. Tommy shot his father once in the head, at close range. The shot killed Thomas Gilbert Sr. almost instantly. He collapsed onto the bed, blood spreading across the expensive linens. And then Tommy tried to stage the scene. He placed the gun in his father's hand, trying to make it look like a suicide. He positioned the body. He may have wiped surfaces, trying to remove his fingerprints, though the forensic evidence on this point was unclear. And then he left. He walked out of the apartment, locked the door behind him, and went home to his own apartment as if nothing had happened. Shelley returned maybe 20 minutes later with the sandwich her son had requested. She let herself into the apartment, and she found her husband dead on the bedroom floor, the gun near his hand, blood everywhere. She called 911 immediately. Then NYPD responded within minutes. The initial assessment at the scene was possible suicide. A 70-year-old man with a gunshot wound to the head, the weapon near his hand, it fit the pattern. But the detectives who responded weren't satisfied. Experienced investigators develop instincts about scenes, and something felt wrong. The position of the body, the location of the gun, the lack of a note, the fact that Thomas Gilbert Sr. had no known history of depression or financial troubles, nothing that typically precipitates suicide in men of his age and circumstances. They treated it as a suspicious death and began a thorough investigation. The first major break came from Shelley herself. She told detectives about Tommy's visit, about how he'd sent her out to get a sandwich, which in retrospect seemed like a deliberate attempt to get her out of the apartment, about the escalating conflict over the allowance. Detectives went to Tommy's apartment on Rector Street in Lower Manhattan. They found him there, and the interview that followed was bizarre. Tommy didn't immediately confess, but his behavior was so erratic and his story so contradictory that it became clear he was involved. He claimed he'd gone to see his father, but left before anything happened. He claimed his father had been depressed and suicidal, which no one who knew Thomas Sr. believed for a second. He claimed, and this was particularly absurd, that his father had threatened him with the gun, and it had gone off accidentally during a struggle. The forensic evidence contradicted every version of Tommy's story. The angle of the gunshot, the lack of defensive wounds, the absence of gunshot residue on Thomas Sr.'s hands and patterns, consistent with firing a weapon. All of it pointed to homicide, not suicide or accident. Tommy was arrested and charged with murder in the second degree. The trial, when it finally occurred in 2019 after years of delays and competency evaluations, was a window into a particular kind of American tragedy. The prosecution's case was straightforward. Tommy had murdered his father in cold blood over a $300 monthly allowance reduction. The motive was rage mixed with entitlement, the fury of someone who believed he deserved his father's money, and that any attempt to control or reduce that money was an attack that justified lethal retaliation. The defense tried to argue mental illness. They brought in psychiatrists who diagnosed Tommy with various personality disorders, who testified about his inability to cope with stress, his distorted sense of reality. They suggested that years of privilege had essentially disabled him, left him incapable of functioning in the real world, where people don't just give you money because you want it. The jury didn't buy it. Or rather, they acknowledged that Tommy might have psychological issues, but they determined that he knew what he was doing when he shot his father, that he had planned it, sending his mother away, bringing the gun, attempting to stage the scene afterward. Those actions demonstrated consciousness of guilt and premeditation. In June 2019, Thomas Gilbert Jr. was convicted of murder in the second degree. He was sentenced to 30 years to life in prison. The case received significant media attention, partly because of the wealth involved, partly because of the sheer absurdity of the motive, but mostly because it exposed something toxic at the heart of a certain kind of American privilege. Tommy Gilbert wasn't poor. He wasn't desperate. He wasn't facing homelessness or starvation or any of the circumstances that drive most violence in America. He was a Princeton graduate with every advantage money could buy, living in Manhattan, continuing to socialize in the Hamptons, receiving thousands of dollars monthly for doing nothing. And he murdered his father over a $300 reduction in that allowance. The sense of entitlement required to commit that crime is almost incomprehensible to most people. The rage at being told no, at being asked to accept slightly less than he wanted, was so overwhelming that it overrode every normal human constraint: love, morality, basic recognition that your father is a person rather than just a funding source. Psychologists who analyzed the case, not those hired by either side but those who commented from a distance, pointed to a phenomenon sometimes called affluenza, though that term is controversial and many professionals dislike it. The idea is that extreme wealth, particularly inherited or unearned wealth, can create psychological dysfunction. It can arrest development, preventing the maturation that comes from facing consequences and limitations. It can create entitlement so extreme that any denial feels like an attack. It can make people functionally incapable of coping with normal adult responsibilities. Tommy Gilbert had never faced real consequences. When he failed at prep school, money bought tutors. When he couldn't hold a job, his allowance continued. When he wanted to maintain a lifestyle he couldn't afford, his father paid. Every failure was cushioned, every consequence avoided, every limit pushed back through the application of wealth, until his father finally said no, finally imposed a limit however small, and Tommy responded with murder. There's a particular tragedy in Thomas Gilbert Sr.'s death. He was, by all accounts, a good man, successful but not showy. He tried to raise his son with values, though clearly something went wrong in that process. And in the end, his attempt to finally impose some discipline, to force his 30-year-old son to start living within constraints, cost him his life. Shelley Gilbert lost both her husband and her son on January 4th, 2015. One to murder, one to the prison system. She testified at Tommy's trial, a moment of almost unbearable sadness as she described finding her husband's body and realizing her son had killed him. The apartment on Beekman Place, with its views of the East River and its quiet elegance, is just a crime scene now in the public imagination. Someone else lives there, presumably. Life continues. But for anyone who knows the story, that address is permanently marked by what happened there. A father murdered by his son. Over money. Over control. Over the rage of a man-child who never learned that the world doesn't exist to serve his needs. Thomas Gilbert Jr. is currently serving his sentence in a New York State prison. He'll be eligible for parole when he's 60 years old. Whether he'll ever fully understand what he did, whether he'll ever feel genuine remorse rather than just anger at being caught and punished, those questions remain open. What isn't open is what happened on January 4th, 2015. A son sent his mother away, walked into his father's bedroom, and pulled the trigger over $300 a month. That's the story. That's the reality beneath the Ivy League credentials and the Beekman Place address and all the trappings of success and privilege. Sometimes the monster isn't breaking in through the window. Sometimes he has a key, and sometimes he's your own son. The bathtub on New Year's Eve, December 31st, 29. Upper West Side, Manhattan, West 68th Street. New Year's Eve in New York is chaos and celebration compressed into a single night. Times Square fills with 1 million people waiting for the ball to drop. Restaurants are booked months in advance. Parties rage in penthouses and brownstones across all 5 boroughs. It's a night when the entire city stays up past midnight, when champagne flows freely, when resolutions are made and immediately broken. It's also, statistically, one of the most dangerous nights of the year. Emergency rooms fill with injuries from celebrations gone wrong. The NYPD is stretched thin, managing crowds and responding to incidents. Ambulances navigate gridlocked streets, carrying people who drank too much or fought too hard or made catastrophically bad decisions. In the chaos of New Year's Eve, it's easier for crimes to hide, for violence to blend into the background noise of a city celebrating. Sheila Danishevsky-Kovlin understood chaos intimately. She was a vice president at UBS, one of the world's largest financial institutions, working in the kind of high-pressure environment where million-dollar decisions were made hourly. She was brilliant with numbers, respected by her colleagues, successful in a male-dominated field where women had to work twice as hard to receive half the credit. She was also Orthodox Jewish, part of a tight-knit community on the Upper West Side where faith and tradition structured daily life. She observed Shabbat. She kept kosher. She was raising her two children, 9-year-old Anna and 3-year-old Miles, within the framework of Jewish law and custom. And she was in the process of divorcing her husband, Roderick Kovlin. The marriage had been troubled for years. Rod, as everyone called him, was a backgammon professional, one of those careers that sounds glamorous but rarely produces actual income unless you're in the top tier of players. He'd also worked intermittently as a stockbroker, though never with the success or stability that Sheila had achieved in her career. The dynamic was clear. Sheila was the breadwinner. She supported the family. She paid for the Upper West Side apartment, for the children's private schools, for the lifestyle that Rod enjoyed but couldn't afford on his own. And Rod resented it deeply. The kind of resentment that eats at a man who believes he should be the provider, who cannot accept that his wife is more successful than he is, who interprets her financial independence as a personal attack on his masculinity. By 2009, the marriage was effectively over. They were separated, working through the legal mechanics of divorce, negotiating custody and financial arrangements. Sheila had made it clear she wanted Rod out of her life and away from any control over her finances. She had also recently increased her life insurance policy. The new policy was worth over $1 million, and initially, Rod was listed as the beneficiary. But Sheila had started the process of changing the beneficiary to her parents, removing Rod from any financial benefit from her death. The paperwork hadn't been finalized yet. An administrative delay, the kind that happens in large institutions where changes require multiple approvals and signatures. That delay would prove fatal. On December 31st, 2009, Sheila spent the day with her children. It was her turn for custody. The divorce meant they were alternating time with the kids according to a court-mandated schedule. She had plans for a quiet New Year's Eve at home with Anna and Miles, avoiding the chaos of the city celebrations. Around 9:30 p.m., according to the timeline later reconstructed by investigators, Rod came to the apartment. He still had keys despite the separation, a point of ongoing conflict, as Sheila had asked for them back multiple times, but Rod had refused or delayed returning them. What happened next is based on forensic evidence and Rod's own statements, which were contradictory and evolved as investigators pressed him. At some point during his visit, while the children were presumably in another room or already in bed, Rod attacked Sheila. The medical examiner would later determine that she was strangled. Manual strangulation, meaning someone used their hands to compress her neck until she lost consciousness and died. It's an intimate, brutal way to kill someone. It requires sustained pressure for several minutes. It requires holding someone while they struggle, while they fight for air, while they die slowly. After killing her, Rod placed her body in the bathtub. He positioned her carefully, staging the scene to look like an accident. He filled the tub partway with water. He may have added blood, either from injuries sustained during the struggle or deliberately applied afterward, to make it look like she had slipped, hit her head, and drowned. The staging was elaborate and thought through. Rod understood that he needed the death to look like an accident rather than a homicide. He needed to create a plausible scenario that would explain why a healthy 47-year-old woman was dead in her bathtub on New Year's Eve. And then he left, locking the apartment behind him. The body was discovered the next morning, New Year's Day, 2010, by Sheila's daughter Anna, who was 9 years old. Imagine that for a moment. Imagine being 9 years old, waking up on New Year's Day, and finding your mother dead in the bathtub. The trauma is almost incomprehensible. The kind of thing that shapes a person forever, that creates a before and after that can never be reconciled. Anna called 911. First responders arrived and found Sheila in the bathtub, exactly as Rod had positioned her. The initial assessment was accidental death, a slip and fall in the tub, possibly combined with drowning. Tragic, but not immediately suspicious. Rod arrived at the apartment shortly after the emergency responders, playing the role of the devastated husband. He cried. He appeared shocked. He told investigators that Sheila had been taking a bath, that she must have slipped, that it was a terrible accident. And here's where the religious aspect of Sheila's life became criminally significant. Under Orthodox Jewish law, bodies should be buried as quickly as possible after death, ideally within 24 hours. There are exceptions for Shabbat and certain holidays, but the general principle is that the dead should be laid to rest promptly, with minimal intervention to the body. This tradition is in direct conflict with standard forensic procedures for suspicious deaths, which require thorough autopsies, toxicology testing, detailed examination of injuries, all things that take time and involve significant handling of the body. Sheila's family, devastated by her death and following their religious obligations, wanted to bury her immediately. They pressured the medical examiner's office to release the body without a full autopsy. They argued that the death was obviously accidental, that there was no need for invasive examination, that their religious requirements should be respected. And in a decision that investigators would come to deeply regret, the medical examiner's office agreed. Sheila Danishevsky was buried on January 3, 2010, without a complete autopsy. Her body was placed in the ground, with the evidence of her murder still locked in her tissues and bones. Rod walked away from her funeral, a free man. And as the beneficiary of her life insurance policy, the change to remove him hadn't been finalized before her death. But Sheila's family wasn't satisfied. Something felt wrong. Her brother, Joel, and her parents began asking questions that the NYPD should have asked from the beginning. Why would Sheila, who was meticulous and careful, slip in the bathtub? She wasn't drunk. Toxicology on the limited samples available showed nothing. She had no medical conditions that would cause sudden loss of balance or consciousness. Why was Rod at the apartment so quickly after the body was discovered? How did he know to come unless he already knew something had happened? And most damningly, why was Rod so obsessed with getting access to Sheila's money immediately? He was pressuring the insurance company to pay out before the investigation was complete. He was asking about Sheila's bank accounts, her investments, her estate. His behavior wasn't that of a grieving husband. It was that of someone waiting for a payoff. Joel Danishevsky, Sheila's brother, became the family's advocate for justice. He pushed the NYPD to reopen the investigation. He hired private investigators to look into Rod's background and movements on the night of Sheila's death. He went to the media, giving interviews that kept pressure on law enforcement to treat his sister's death as the murder he believed it was. Then NYPD's investigation, once reopened with proper scrutiny, began finding problems with the accident theory immediately. The bathtub itself didn't support the scenario. There were no signs of a slip, no skid marks, no displaced bath mats, nothing to suggest someone had lost their footing. The pattern of blood didn't match someone hitting their head on the tub's edge. And the position of the body was too neat, too carefully arranged. Detectives also discovered Rod's financial motive. He was deeply in debt. His backgammon career wasn't generating income. He had no legitimate source of money. And he'd been pressuring Sheila for financial support even after their separation, requests she'd been refusing. But the most damning evidence was lost in the ground with Sheila's body. Without a proper autopsy, without tissue samples and detailed forensic examination, proving that she'd been strangled rather than drowned was nearly impossible. The Danishevsky family made an extraordinary decision. They agreed to have Sheila's body exhumed. In March 2010, just 2 months after her burial, Sheila was dug up and her body was finally given the forensic examination it should have received immediately after her death. The findings were conclusive. Sheila Danishevsky had been strangled. The hyoid bone in her neck showed damage consistent with manual strangulation. The pattern of injuries was incompatible with a slip and fall. This was murder, not accident. Armed with this evidence, the NYPD intensified their investigation into Rod Kovlin. But building a prosecutable case, proved frustratingly difficult. Rod had staged the scene well. There was no physical evidence directly linking him to the murder. No DNA under Sheila's fingernails. If there had been, it was lost during the 2 months before exhumation. No witnesses, no murder weapon to trace. The case relied on circumstantial evidence, motive, opportunity, behavior after the death. Strong circumstantial evidence, but circumstantial nonetheless. The investigation also uncovered increasingly disturbing information about Rod's character and his relationship with his children. After Sheila's death, Rod had gained full custody of Anna and Miles, and he began a campaign to poison them against their mother's memory. He told them their mother hadn't loved them. He isolated them from Sheila's family, limiting contact with their grandparents and uncle, who were trying to maintain the children's connection to their Jewish heritage and to their mother's memory. Most disturbingly, investigators discovered that Rod had tried to manipulate Anna, 9 years old, traumatized from finding her mother's body, into lying for him. He'd coached her on what to say to police, trying to get her to provide an alibi for his whereabouts on New Year's Eve. The investigation dragged on for years. Rod wasn't arrested immediately after the exhumation findings. The district attorney's office wanted an airtight case, knowing that Rod could afford expensive lawyers and that a failed prosecution would mean he could never be tried again for Sheila's murder. During this time, Rod's behavior became increasingly erratic and suspicious. He violated court orders regarding custody. He attempted to access money from Sheila's estate despite ongoing disputes. He made statements to various people that, in retrospect, sounded like admissions of guilt cloaked in hypotheticals. Finally, in November 2014, nearly 5 years after Sheila's death, Rod Coughlin was arrested and charged with murder in the second degree. The trial took several more years to reach court, with numerous delays and legal maneuverings. It finally went to trial in 2019. The prosecution's case was methodical and damning. They presented the forensic evidence from the exhumation showing strangulation. They presented Rod's financial motive, the life insurance policy, his debts, his lack of income. They presented his behavior after the murder, the immediate focus on money, the attempts to manipulate his children, the lies about his whereabouts. They also presented evidence that Rod had been researching how to kill someone in ways that would look like an accident. Computer searches on his devices included queries about drowning, about how long it takes someone to die from lack of oxygen, about whether strangulation could be mistaken for other causes of death. The defense tried to argue that the investigation had been botched from the beginning, that the delayed autopsy meant evidence was compromised, that the circumstantial case didn't prove guilt beyond reasonable doubt. The jury didn't agree. In March 2019, Roderick Coughlin was convicted of murder in the second degree. He was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. At his sentencing, members of Sheila's family finally had the opportunity to address him directly, to tell him about the person he'd murdered and the family he'd destroyed. Joel Danishevsky, Sheila's brother who had fought for years to see justice done, spoke about his sister, her brilliance, her dedication to her children, her love of life. He spoke about the hole her absence had left in their family. And he spoke about Rod's cruelty, not just in murdering Sheila, but in trying to erase her memory and poison her children against her. Rod showed no remorse. Even at sentencing, he maintained his innocence, claimed he was being railroaded, insisted that Sheila's death had been an accident, and that her family had manufactured evidence against him. Anna and Miles, Sheila's children, were eventually placed in the custody of her parents. They're teenagers now, growing up without their mother, trying to build lives from the wreckage Rod created. The trauma of what happened, not just losing their mother, but discovering her body, being manipulated by their father, learning that he murdered her, is something they'll carry forever. The case highlighted several critical failures in the system. The decision to release Sheila's body for burial without a proper autopsy was a catastrophic error that nearly allowed a murderer to walk free. It demonstrated the tension between respecting religious customs and ensuring proper investigation of suspicious deaths, a tension that doesn't have easy answers but requires protocols that protect both values. The delay in prosecuting Rod, while understandable from a legal strategy perspective, meant he had years to continue controlling and damaging his children, to spend money that should have gone to support them, to live free while Sheila lay in the ground. But ultimately, persistence paid off. Joel Daniszewski's refusal to accept the accident narrative, his willingness to push for exhumation despite the religious and emotional difficulties that involved, his years of pressure on law enforcement. That persistence is why Rod was eventually convicted. Sheila Daniszewski died on New Year's Eve, 2009. She was 47 years old. She was successful, intelligent, a dedicated mother who was working to build a life free from a toxic marriage. She died in her bathtub, strangled by the man she'd once loved, killed for money he felt entitled to even as their marriage crumbled. The water turned red with her blood. And in the chaos of New Year's Eve in New York, with emergency services stretched thin and attention focused elsewhere, her murder nearly disappeared into the category of tragic accident. But it wasn't an accident. It was murder. Deliberate, premeditated, staged. And Rod Kovlin will spend the rest of his life in prison for it, which is exactly where he belongs. The Most Hated Man on Fifth Avenue. January 27, 1955. Fifth Avenue, Upper East Side. If you walked past 814 Fifth Avenue in January 1955, you'd see a mansion that embodied the excess and grandeur of New York's Gilded Age. 6 stories of limestone and marble rising between 62nd and 63rd Streets, directly across from Central Park. The kind of building that screamed wealth not through ostentation but through sheer scale and location. Inside that mansion lived Serge Rubinstein, and he was arguably the most hated man in New York high society. The hatred wasn't casual dislike or social disapproval. It was active, visceral loathing from a staggering number of people who had legitimate reasons to want him dead. Business partners he'd swindled, women he'd seduced and abandoned, governments he'd defrauded, investors he'd bankrupted. The list of people who would have celebrated his demise was essentially a directory of wealthy, powerful individuals across multiple countries. Serge Rubinstein's story is almost too perfectly villainous to be true, like someone had constructed a character specifically designed to be murdered in a mystery novel. But it's all real, and so is his unsolved murder. Rubinstein was born in Russia before the revolution, the son of a banker. When the Bolsheviks came to power, the family fled, eventually settling in Europe. Serge demonstrated from an early age a brilliant mind for finance and an absolute lack of moral constraints about how he used that brilliance. By his 20s, he was running financial schemes across Europe, currency manipulation, stock fraud, elaborate cons that separated investors from their money with remarkable efficiency. He was so successful and so notorious that he was eventually forced to leave Europe entirely, his reputation preceding him in ways that made it impossible to continue operating there. He came to New York in the late 1930s, seeing America as fresh territory full of people who didn't yet know his reputation. And he immediately began doing what he did best, making money through any means necessary, legal or otherwise. Rubinstein's schemes were sophisticated and varied. He'd buy controlling interests in companies using other people's money, then systematically loot the company's assets for his own benefit, leaving investors with worthless stock. He'd manipulate stock prices through false information and insider trading, practices that were less strictly regulated in the 1940s than they are today, but still deeply unethical. He had a particular talent for finding loopholes, legal gray areas where what he was doing wasn't technically illegal but was absolutely immoral. And when his actions were illegal, he had expensive lawyers who could usually find ways to get him off or reduce penalties to fines that were just another cost of doing business. His personal life was equally scandalous. He married multiple times, always to wealthy women, and the marriages always ended badly with accusations of manipulation and financial exploitation. He maintained numerous affairs simultaneously, often with the wives and daughters of the business partners he was swindling, adding personal insult to financial injury. But perhaps his most hated action came during World War II. While millions of young American men were drafted and sent to fight, Rubinstein used his wealth and connections to avoid military service entirely. He claimed exemptions based on various health issues, paid doctors to provide documentation, and hired lawyers to fight the draft board's attempts to conscript him. The result was that, while Americans were dying on European beaches and Pacific islands, Serge Rubinstein was living in his Fifth Avenue mansion, making money from wartime economic activity, hosting lavish parties, and flaunting his immunity from the sacrifice others were making. This made him not just hated by the people he personally wronged, but by broad swaths of the American public. He became known as the Cobra, a nickname that perfectly captured both his dangerous cunning and his poisonous nature. By 1955, Rubenstein's list of enemies was extraordinary in its length and diversity. Business partners he'd defrauded, who'd lost millions to his schemes. Former wives and mistresses, some of whom he'd systematically financially destroyed. Investors who'd trusted him with their life savings and been left with nothing. Government agencies in multiple countries who considered him a criminal, but hadn't been able to make charges stick definitively. Organized crime figures who'd had business dealings with him that went sour. And countless others, everyone from rival financiers to servants he'd mistreated to neighbors who were simply annoyed by his presence in their exclusive neighborhood. The mansion on Fifth Avenue was both his palace and his fortress. He lived there surrounded by luxury, art collections, expensive furnishings, all the trappings of wealth accumulated through decades of financial predation. But he also lived there in isolation, with few genuine friends and many powerful enemies. On the night of January 26, 1955, Rubenstein was at home. He'd had dinner. Accounts vary on whether he was alone or had company earlier in the evening. By late night, he was definitely alone, dressed in silk pajamas, preparing for bed. Sometime after midnight, someone entered the mansion. How they gained entry was never conclusively determined. The doors were locked from the inside, suggesting either Rubenstein had let them in or they had a key. The mansion's security was supposedly sophisticated for the era, but it wasn't breached by force. What happened next was discovered the following morning when a servant arrived and found Rubenstein's body in his bedroom on an upper floor. He was dead on the floor, bound with cord taken from the Venetian blinds that covered his windows. His hands were tied behind his back. More cord was wrapped around his neck, used to strangle him. The strangulation had been brutal and sustained. He'd fought against his restraints hard enough to cause injuries to his wrists. He was still in his silk pajamas, suggesting he'd been attacked either in bed or shortly before retiring. There were signs of a struggle, furniture displaced, items knocked over, but nothing that suggested a prolonged fight. Whoever killed him had overcome him relatively quickly, restrained him, and then strangled him deliberately. The murder scene told a story of personal hatred rather than robbery. Nothing was stolen from the mansion. The valuable art remained on the walls. Cash and jewelry in the bedroom were untouched. Whoever killed Rubenstein had come for him specifically, not for his possessions. The NYPD investigation was immediate and extensive. This was a high-profile murder of a infamous figure in a mansion on Fifth Avenue. The media coverage was intense, and the pressure to solve the case was enormous. The problem was that the list of suspects was absurdly long. Detectives began with the obvious: people who had recently been in direct conflict with Rubenstein, business partners involved in current disputes, women he was currently involved with or had recently discarded, anyone with immediate pressing grievances. The list was still impossibly long. They interviewed hundreds of people: business associates, former wives, servants and employees, neighbors, anyone who might have seen something suspicious on the night of the murder. What emerged was a picture of Rubenstein's final weeks that was almost comically filled with conflict. He'd been involved in multiple simultaneous business disputes. He was being sued by at least 3 different parties. He'd recently ended affairs with 2 different women, both of whom were reportedly furious. He'd stiffed contractors working on the mansion. He'd quarreled with staff. Any one of these conflicts might have generated enough anger to motivate murder. The problem was narrowing down which specific grievance had actually tipped someone over the edge from hatred to action. The investigation also considered the possibility of professional killers. Rubenstein had connections to organized crime through various business dealings. Had he cheated the wrong people? Had he been targeted for a hit? But professional killers don't typically strangle victims with Venetian blind cords. That's personal, intimate, almost improvisational. It's the kind of murder method that suggests rage and opportunity rather than cold planning. The forensic evidence was limited by 1955 standards. There was no DNA testing. Fingerprint analysis found numerous prints in the mansion, but with Rubenstein's habit of hosting parties and meetings, it was impossible to determine which prints belonged to the killer and which were from legitimate visitors. The medical examiner determined time of death to be sometime between midnight and 3 a.m. on January 27th. Cause of death was asphyxiation by strangulation. But beyond these basic facts, the physical evidence didn't point to any specific individual. As weeks turned to months, the investigation stalled. Detectives had theories, suspects they favored, but nothing approaching the evidence needed for prosecution. The case remained open but unsolved. Over the years since, amateur investigators and true crime enthusiasts have proposed numerous theories about who killed Serge Rubinstein. Some believe it was a business partner or investor who'd been ruined by one of Rubinstein's schemes. The personal nature of the strangulation and the use of materials from the room, the blind cords, suggests someone who came to confront him and whose anger escalated to murder in the moment. Others suggest a woman scorned, one of his former wives or mistresses who'd been used and discarded. Hell hath no fury, and Rubinstein had certainly generated plenty of fury in his romantic life. Still others point to organized crime. Rubinstein had dealt with mob-connected figures in various business ventures. Perhaps he'd welched on a debt or tried to cheat the wrong people, and his death was a message. A darker theory suggests someone acting on behalf of the US government or military. Rubinstein's draft dodging during World War II had made him a symbol of wealthy immunity from sacrifice. Could someone connected to military families who'd lost sons have taken vigilante justice? The truth is, we'll never know. Too many people wanted Rubinstein dead. Too many had means and motive. And too much time has passed for any new evidence to emerge. What we do know is that Serge Rubinstein lived a life that was almost designed to generate mortal enemies. Every action he took, every scheme he ran, every person he betrayed, it all accumulated into a ledger of grievances that practically guaranteed someone would eventually kill him. The only surprise, perhaps, is that it took as long as it did. Rubinstein's mansion on Fifth Avenue stood for decades after his death, a monument to wealth accumulated through ruthless financial predation. It's since been demolished and replaced, the land too valuable to preserve as a memorial to a hated financier. His will, when it was executed, revealed that despite all his schemes and accumulated wealth, his estate was tangled in debts and disputed assets. The people he'd swindled filed claims. Former wives demanded settlements. The government wanted back taxes. What had seemed like a fortune was consumed by the chaos of his unresolved obligations. In the end, Rubinstein died as he lived, surrounded by enemies, isolated despite his wealth, destroyed by the hatred he'd so carefully cultivated over decades of predatory behavior. The murder remains officially unsolved. The case file sits in NYPD archives, gathering dust alongside thousands of other cold cases. But perhaps the real mystery isn't who killed Serge Rubinstein. The real mystery is why anyone would be surprised that someone did. When you spend your entire life making enemies, when you destroy everyone you touch, when you flaunt your immunity from consequences and your contempt for others, eventually, someone balances the scales. Serge Rubinstein's murder was almost inevitable. The only question was which of his many enemies would be the one to finally act. And that question remains unanswered, buried with him wherever he's buried. If anyone even bothered to erect a marker for the Cobra, who struck so many but couldn't strike fast enough to prevent his own death. The Peninsula Hotel Tragedy, February 5th, 201. The Peninsula Hotel, 5th Avenue and 55th Street. The Peninsula, New York is one of those hotels that exists in a different economic universe than most people ever experience. Rooms start at over $1,000 per night. Suites can run $10,000 or more. The lobby features Art Deco design and impeccable service. The clientele is international, wealthy travelers, business executives, celebrities who want privacy and luxury in equal measure. It's the kind of place where staff are trained to anticipate needs before guests articulate them. Where do not disturb signs are respected absolutely. Where what happens in the rooms is considered sacrosanct, protected by the hotel's reputation for discretion. That discretion, that respect for privacy, can sometimes hide terrible things. In early February 2010, Gigi Jordan checked into the Peninsula with her 8-year-old son, Jude Mira. Jordan was a pharmaceutical executive, a millionaire several times over through successful business ventures. She had founded and sold multiple companies, accumulating wealth that put her solidly in the category of the ultra-rich. She booked a suite, not for a night or a weekend, but for an extended stay. The kind of booking that suggests someone settling in, planning to remain for a while. The hotel staff, trained to be attentive but not intrusive, noted the booking and prepared the suite to Peninsula standards. They had no reason to be concerned. Wealthy guests sometimes stayed for extended periods during business in the city. It wasn't unusual. What was happening inside the suite, however, was far from usual. Jude Mira was autistic. He had significant special needs that required constant attention and specialized care. He was nonverbal, unable to communicate in traditional ways, and his mother was unraveling. The exact timeline of what happened in that Peninsula suite is based on forensic evidence and Gigi Jordan's own contradictory statements afterward. But the basic facts are these. Over a period of hours, possibly an entire day, Jordan force-fed her son a massive overdose of pills. She crushed medications and mixed them with liquids, then made Jude ingest them. The amount was staggering. Enough pills to kill an adult, let alone a small 8-year-old boy. Jude died in the suite, in the luxury surroundings of a 5-star hotel, while other guests were enjoying room service and spa treatments just walls away. After killing him, Jordan attempted to take her own life with an overdose. But either she miscalculated the dosage or had second thoughts, because she didn't die. She was found unconscious in the suite with Jude's body, both of them surrounded by empty pill bottles. Hotel staff discovered them when Jordan failed to respond to housekeeping knocks and welfare check attempts. The Do Not Disturb sign had been up for long enough that even the Peninsula's respect for privacy was overridden by concern. Police and paramedics arrived to find the scene. A dead child, an unconscious mother, and enough pharmaceutical evidence to suggest a murder-suicide attempt. Jordan survived. She was hospitalized, treated for the overdose, and then arrested and charged with murder in the second degree. The case that followed was complex, disturbing, and raised difficult questions about mental illness, parental rights, and the responsibilities we have to the most vulnerable members of society. Jordan's defense strategy was built around a claim of mercy killing. Her lawyers argued that she had killed Jude not out of malice, but out of a desperate, delusional belief that she was protecting him from worse fates. The narrative that constructed went like this. Jordan believed, genuinely believed, though without evidence, that Jude's biological father and Jordan's ex-husband were part of conspiracies to harm Jude. She claimed they were involved in abuse, possibly even organized sexual exploitation rings. She claimed she had received threats. She claimed that forces beyond her control were closing in and that Jude was in imminent danger. And so, in her fractured mental state, she decided that the only way to protect Jude from these imagined horrors was to kill him herself. A mercy killing, saving him from abuse by ending his life in a luxury hotel suite. The prosecution's case was more straightforward and far more damning. Gigi Jordan was a narcissistic, controlling woman whose wealth had insulated her from consequences for years. When her son's special needs became too burdensome, when the reality of raising a severely autistic child conflicted with her desired lifestyle, she decided to eliminate the problem. The murder was premeditated. She'd planned the extended hotel stay, purchased the medications, brought them to the suite, and methodically killed her son over hours. The attempted suicide was either genuine regret after the act or a calculated move to generate sympathy and avoid prosecution. The trial revealed deeply disturbing aspects of Jordan's behavior in the months and years before Jude's death. She'd been increasingly paranoid, making wild accusations against multiple people in her life. She'd been isolating herself and Jude, cutting off contact with family and former friends. She'd been spending money erratically, making bizarre business decisions, showing signs of mental deterioration that people around her had noticed but hadn't known how to address. There was also evidence that Jordan had been researching methods of killing and suicide in the weeks before checking into the Peninsula. Computer searches on her devices included queries about lethal drug dosages, about how long different medications take to work, about whether certain drug combinations would be detected in autopsies. The mercy-killing defense required the jury to believe that Jordan's paranoid delusions were so severe that she genuinely believed killing Jude was the only way to protect him. The prosecution argued that even if she believed that, it didn't justify murder, that the correct response to believing your child is in danger is to go to police, to seek help, not to poison him in a hotel room. The forensic evidence from the scene was heartbreaking. The sheer number of pills Jordan had forced Jude to ingest suggested a prolonged process. Jude couldn't communicate, couldn't resist effectively, was completely dependent on his mother to care for him, and she used that dependence to murder him. The jury struggled with the case. The deliberations were lengthy. Ultimately, they convicted Jordan of manslaughter rather than murder, determining that she had acted under extreme emotional disturbance, but that her actions were still criminal. She was sentenced to 18 years in prison. But the legal proceedings didn't end there. Jordan's defense team filed appeals, arguing that the trial had been unfair, that evidence of her mental state hadn't been properly considered. The case wound through appellate courts for years. In 2020, in a controversial decision that outraged prosecutors and Jude's surviving family members, Jordan's conviction was overturned on technical grounds related to jury instructions. The appeals court determined that the trial judge had made errors in explaining the law to the jury, errors significant enough to warrant a new trial. Jordan was released on bail pending retrial. And then, in early 2021, she died, reportedly from an illness, though the details were kept private. Her death meant there would be no retrial, no final legal accounting for Jude's murder. The case raises uncomfortable questions that don't have easy answers. How much does mental illness excuse or mitigate criminal behavior? Jordan clearly had psychological issues, paranoia, delusions, distorted thinking. But millions of people have mental illness without committing murder. Where's the line between diminished capacity and criminal responsibility? What are the responsibilities of the wealthy when their mental health deteriorates? Jordan had resources that most people can't imagine. She could have hired the best psychiatrists, the most specialized care for Jude, any support she needed. But wealth didn't prevent her from spiraling, and it may have actually enabled her decline by allowing her to isolate without anyone able to intervene. And what about Jude? He had no voice in any of this. He couldn't tell anyone what was happening, couldn't call for help, couldn't understand why his mother was forcing pills down his throat. He died confused, probably in pain, certainly terrified, in a luxury hotel suite that cost more per night than many people earn in a month. The Peninsula Hotel, like any hotel dealing with a high-profile crime in its rooms, tried to move past the incident quietly. The suite was cleaned and renovated. New guests stayed there, probably without knowing what had happened within those walls. But for anyone who knows the story, the Peninsula is marked by Jude Mira's death. The golden lighting in the corridors, the pristine rooms, the luxury and comfort, all of it contrasted with the reality of what happened in February 2010. A mother murdered her son. Not in a moment of rage, not in a sudden break from reality, but over hours, methodically, in one of the most expensive hotels in New York. The thick walls that provide privacy to wealthy guests also hid the crime. The Do Not Disturb sign that protects guests from interruption also protected Jordan while she killed Jude. And the wealth that bought access to that suite, that luxury, that privacy, it couldn't buy Jude's life back or erase what his mother did to him. Gigi Jordan is dead now. She died without serving the full sentence for Jude's murder, without facing a retrial, without any final legal accountability. Jude Mira is dead too. He was 8 years old. He never had a chance to grow up, to find ways to communicate despite his autism, to experience life beyond the control of a mother whose paranoia destroyed them both. The only winners in this story are the lawyers who collected millions in fees throughout the lengthy legal proceedings. Everyone else lost, especially Jude. The Sleeping Beauty of the Upper East Side, December 21st, 1980. Upper East Side, Manhattan. Christmas was 4 days away. The Upper East Side was decorated for the holidays. Wreaths on townhouse doors, lights strung in windows overlooking Central Park, the smell of evergreen from Christmas trees carried home by doormen. It was the season when New York's wealthy retreated into their private celebrations, family gatherings, in apartments worth millions, parties where champagne flowed, and diamonds glittered under crystal chandeliers. In one of those privileged households behind doors that opened only to the right people, a woman was dying. Her name was Martha Sonny von Bülow. She was 51 years old, an heiress to a utilities fortune worth tens of millions of dollars. Her wealth came from her father, George Crawford, a utilities magnate whose business acumen had built an empire. Sunny had inherited that fortune, making her one of the wealthiest women in America. She lived between two worlds of extreme privilege, a Fifth Avenue apartment in Manhattan and a mansion in Newport, Rhode Island called Clarendon Court. Newport, for those unfamiliar with American aristocracy, is where old money goes to be among other old money, where cottages. The deliberately modest name for palatial estates lie in the cliffs overlooking the Atlantic. Sunny's life looked perfect from the outside. Wealth beyond most people's imagination. Beautiful homes. A prominent place in the social register. She had everything that American success supposedly delivers. Except happiness. Except safety. Except, as it turned out, consciousness. Sunny was married to Claus von Bülow, a Danish-born socialite who'd made his living not through business or career but through connections and marriage. He was charming, educated, sophisticated, the kind of European aristocrat that American high society found fascinating. He spoke multiple languages. He had impeccable manners. He knew how to navigate the complex social hierarchies of the ultra-wealthy. But the marriage was troubled in ways that Sunny's wealth and Claus's charm couldn't paper over. They'd been together for years, but by 1980, the relationship had deteriorated into something cold and dysfunctional. They maintained appearances in public, attended the right parties, hosted the appropriate gatherings, but privately, the marriage was essentially over in everything but legal status. Sunny had developed problems with alcohol and prescription medications. The exact extent of her dependency was disputed and would become a central point of contention in the legal battles that followed. But it was clear she was self-medicating something: depression, unhappiness, the existential emptiness that sometimes comes with having everything material but nothing meaningful. Claus, meanwhile, was having an affair. Her name was Alexandra Isles, a soap opera actress who represented everything Sunny wasn't: younger, vibrant, uncomplicated by the weight of inherited fortune. The relationship was ongoing and serious enough that Claus was apparently considering leaving Sunny, though divorce would mean losing access to her fortune. A financial catastrophe for a man who'd never actually earned significant money independently. On December 21, 1980, Sunny was at Clarendon Court in Newport. It was cold, the Atlantic wind cutting across the mansion's grounds with the kind of bitter chill that makes even the largest heated rooms feel drafty. Christmas was approaching, but there was no warmth in the von Bülow household. Just the performance of seasonal normalcy stretched thin over a marriage that had died years earlier. Sometime that evening, Sunny was found unconscious on the marble floor of her bathroom. She was rushed to Newport Hospital in an ambulance, the medical staff working frantically to stabilize her. The initial diagnosis was hypoglycemia, dangerously low blood sugar, that had caused her to lose consciousness. For a normal person, this might be unusual, but not necessarily alarming. For someone with Sunny's history of alcohol consumption and irregular eating habits, she was known to skip meals, to drink instead of eating. It was concerning but not immediately suspicious. She recovered from that episode. She regained consciousness after treatment, was stabilized, returned home to Clarendon Court. It seemed like a frightening medical incident, the kind of thing that happens to people who don't take proper care of their health, but ultimately resolved. But here's the critical detail that would become central to everything that followed. The detail that transforms this from a tragic medical incident into a potential attempted murder. This wasn't the first time. Almost exactly 1 year earlier, Christmas 1979, Sunny had suffered a similar incident. Found unconscious in her bathroom, rushed to the hospital, diagnosed with hypoglycemia, recovered after treatment. Once might be a medical anomaly, an unfortunate coincidence. Twice starts to look like a pattern. Twice, at almost exactly the same time of year, begins to suggest that something other than chance is at work. On December 21, 1980, 1 year after the first incident, 4 days before Christmas, with the mansion decorated for the holidays and plans made for family gatherings, Sunny had her final hypoglycemic episode. She was found unconscious on her bathroom floor again. Same location as before. Same symptoms. Almost exactly the same date. But this time, she didn't wake up. Sunny von Bülow slipped into a coma from which she would never emerge. She was rushed to the hospital, placed on life support, attended by the best doctors her fortune could buy. Neurologists examined her. Specialists consulted. The most advanced medical technology available in 1980 was deployed to try to revive her. Nothing worked. The damage to her brain from prolonged hypoglycemia, from her blood sugar dropping so low that her brain was starved of the glucose it needs to function, was catastrophic and irreversible. She remained in a persistent vegetative state, breathing but not conscious, alive in the technical sense that her heart continued beating and her lungs continued drawing air, but absent in every way that matters for human existence. Initially, the medical establishment treated this as a tragic medical mystery. 2 hypoglycemic episodes in 2 years. The second one catastrophic. Sunny had been drinking heavily. She was known to use prescription medications, tranquilizers, sleeping pills, in ways that her doctors hadn't prescribed. Perhaps she'd developed some metabolic disorder that affected her blood sugar regulation. Perhaps the combination of alcohol, medications, and poor eating habits had created a perfect storm of medical vulnerability. But Sunny's children from her first marriage, Alexander von Auersperg and Annie-Laurie von Auersperg, known as Alla, weren't satisfied with the medical mystery narrative. Something felt profoundly wrong about what had happened to their mother. And as they began investigating her circumstances in the weeks and months after she fell into the coma, they uncovered information that pointed towards something far darker than medical misfortune. They found evidence that Claus had been researching insulin, specifically how insulin injections could cause hypoglycemia in someone who wasn't diabetic. Computer searches, library borrowings, conversations he'd had with people about medical topics he'd never shown interest in before. They discovered that Claus had been in significant financial difficulty, dependent entirely on Sunny's fortune and facing potential destitution if she divorced him, which she'd been discussing with friends and family as an increasingly real possibility. They learned more details about the affair with Alexandra Isles and Claus's expressed desires to leave the marriage and start a new life. Plans that required Sunny to either remain married to him or to conveniently die so he could inherit. And most damningly, they found a black bag in Claus's possession that contained insulin, syringes, and various prescription medications that belonged to Sunny. Why would Claus have insulin? Neither he nor Sunny was diabetic. There was no legitimate medical reason for insulin to be in their possession, let alone in a black bag that Claus kept with his personal belongings. The children hired Richard Koo, a former Manhattan district attorney with extensive experience in complex criminal cases, to conduct a private investigation. Koo's findings were damning enough that the family went to authorities in Rhode Island, where the comas had occurred, and presented evidence that suggested Claus von Bülow had deliberately attempted to murder his wife. The theory they presented was straightforward and horrifying. Claus von Bülow had deliberately injected his wife with insulin on 2 occasions, causing hypoglycemic comas. The first, in December 1979, was a practice run, a test to see if he could do it, if it would be detected by doctors, if Sunny would survive, or if the dose would be fatal. When she survived that first episode, he knew the method worked, but that he needed a larger dose to ensure death. A year later, in December 1980, he tried again. This time, the dose was sufficient to cause irreversible brain damage, leaving Sunny in a permanent coma. Not quite the death he might have intended, but functionally equivalent. She would never recover, never wake up, never pose a threat to his access to her fortune. The motive was obvious and materialistic. Claus would inherit a significant portion of Sunny's fortune if she died. And even in her comatose state, he retained control over her medical care and significant access to her money for her care, money that he could use for his own purposes. In July 1981, 7 months after Sunny fell into her final coma, Claus von Bülow was arrested and charged with 2 counts of attempted murder, 1 for each hypoglycemic episode. The trial that followed, beginning in early 1982, became one of the most publicized criminal cases of the decade, a media circus that exposed the darkest secrets and most sordid details of American aristocracy. The courtroom was packed daily with journalists and spectators fascinated by the spectacle of European nobility on trial for attempted murder in Newport, of all places, the summer playground of American wealth. The prosecution's case was built on several interconnected pillars of evidence. The black bag containing insulin, syringes, and various medications, found in Claus's possession with no legitimate explanation for why he would have these items. expert medical testimony that Sunny's comas were consistent with insulin injection, rather than natural causes or self-induced hypoglycemia from alcohol and drug use. The doctors explained that the pattern of her blood sugar collapse didn't match what they would expect from drinking or medication alone, but did match what they would see from an external insulin injection. Evidence of Claus's financial motive. Extensive documentation showing he was living entirely on Sunny's money, had no independent income, and would be financially destroyed if she divorced him, which she'd been actively considering. Testimony about his affair with Alexandra Isles, and his expressed desires to leave the marriage and start a new life, plans that required Sunny to either stay married to him or conveniently die. And perhaps most compellingly, the pattern. 2 hypoglycemic episodes at almost exactly the same time of year, both occurring when Claus was present in the house, both following evenings when he'd been the last person to see Sunny before she lost consciousness, both benefiting him by either testing his method or achieving his ultimate goal. The defense, led initially by Harold Price Farringer, a skilled criminal attorney from New York, argued that Sunny's comas were self-induced, the result of her own alcoholism and drug addiction combining with her erratic eating habits to create medical crises. They painted a picture of a deeply troubled woman whose lifestyle had slowly destroyed her health, and a husband who was being scapegoated by stepchildren who had never accepted him and who wanted to control their mother's fortune. They argued that the insulin in the black bag had been prescribed to Sunny by a doctor, though they couldn't produce that doctor or any prescription records, and that she'd been injecting herself, possibly as part of some misguided attempt to lose weight or manage her various health issues. They also attacked the credibility of the investigation, arguing that evidence had been gathered improperly, that the black bag had been obtained through searches that violated Claus's constitutional rights, that the testimony of Sunny's children was motivated by financial interest and familial animosity, rather than genuine concern for truth. The first trial, in 1982, resulted in a conviction. The jury, after weeks of testimony and dramatic courtroom confrontations, found Claus Van Bulow guilty on both counts of attempted murder. He was sentenced to 30 years in prison, a sentence that would have kept him incarcerated until he was an old man. But he never served that sentence. His defense team immediately filed appeals, and in 1984, the Rhode Island Supreme Court overturned the conviction in a decision that shocked prosecutors and Sunny's family. The court determined that evidence used at trial, specifically items from the black bag and testimony derived from searches of Claus's personal effects, had been obtained through improper searches conducted by the private investigator Richard Koo and should have been excluded from trial. Claus Van Bulow was granted a new trial, his conviction vacated, released on bail pending retrial. For the retrial in 1985, Claus assembled what the media called a dream team of attorneys led by Alan Dershowitz, one of the most brilliant and controversial legal minds in America. Dershowitz was a Harvard law professor known for taking on difficult, high-profile cases and for his aggressive, intellectually rigorous defense strategies. Dershowitz's strategy for the retrial was methodical, sophisticated, and ultimately devastating to the prosecution's case. He brought in a battery of medical experts who testified that Sunny's comas could have been caused by her own drug and alcohol use combined with aspirin, which can affect blood sugar, that the insulin levels detected in her blood could be explained by factors other than injection, that the prosecution's medical evidence wasn't as conclusive as they'd claimed in the first trial. He systematically attacked the credibility of Sunny's children, suggesting through cross-examination and his own witnesses that Alexander and Alla had financial motives to see Claus convicted and had actively worked to plant evidence or influence the investigation in ways that tainted the entire case. He presented an alternative narrative where Sunny was a deeply troubled woman whose addictions and mental health issues had destroyed her physical health, and Claus was a devoted, if imperfect, husband being scapegoated by stepchildren who never accepted him as part of the family and who saw their mother's fortune being spent on his lifestyle. He exploited every weakness in the prosecution's case, every gap in the timeline, every piece of evidence that could be interpreted in multiple ways. He challenged the chain of custody for the black bag and its contents. He questioned whether the insulin found there had actually been used to inject Sunny or was simply present for some other reason. The jury in the second trial, after weeks of testimony featuring dueling expert witnesses and competing narratives about what had happened to Sonny, found Klaus von Bülow not guilty on both counts. He walked out of the courthouse a free man in June 1985, 3 years after his initial conviction, vindicated in the eyes of the law, if not in the court of public opinion. The verdict was, and remains, one of the most controversial in American legal history, not because the jury necessarily got it wrong from a legal standpoint, but because the truth of what happened to Sonny von Bülow remains genuinely uncertain, lost somewhere in the contradictions between the evidence presented by both sides. Did Klaus inject his wife with insulin, deliberately causing 2 comas with the intention of eventually killing her so he could inherit her fortune? The circumstantial evidence pointing toward that conclusion is strong. Motive, opportunity, the suspicious pattern of incidents occurring at the same time each year, the black bag with its sinister contents that had no legitimate explanation. Or was Sonny a troubled, self-destructive woman whose own substance abuse and erratic behavior caused her medical crises, and Klaus was a convenient scapegoat for family members who wanted to control her fortune and had never accepted him as legitimate family? The defense presented credible alternative explanations for most of the prosecution's evidence, expert witnesses who contradicted the state's medical experts, a narrative that couldn't be entirely dismissed. We'll never know for certain because the only person who could definitively answer the question, Sonny herself, spent the last 28 years of her life in a coma, unable to communicate, unable to tell anyone what happened on those December nights in 1989 and 1988. Sonny von Bülow died on December 6, 2008, at Columbia Presbyterian Medical Center in New York. She had been in a persistent vegetative state for 28 years, cared for in a private facility, maintained on feeding tubes and medical equipment that kept her body functioning long after her consciousness had departed. She was 86 years old when she finally died. She had been unconscious since she was 51. More than half of her years on Earth, 28 out of 58, were spent in that twilight state between life and death, breathing but not living, present but not conscious. Her children, who had fought so hard to see Klaus prosecuted, who had spent years and enormous amounts of their inheritance on legal battles, were with her at the end. They'd spent nearly 3 decades visiting a mother who couldn't recognize them, who couldn't speak or respond or acknowledge their presence in any way. They'd watched her body age while her mind remained frozen at age 51, trapped in whatever last moment of consciousness she'd experienced before the coma claimed her. Klaus von Bülow, for his part, never visited Sonny during those 28 years. Not once. After his acquittal, he separated from her legally and financially, though they never formally divorced, perhaps because divorce would have required acknowledging certain financial reality. He moved to London, where he lived quietly, supported by whatever remained of Sonny's fortune that he'd gained access to, occasionally giving interviews about the case, but mostly fading from public view. He never publicly admitted to attempting to murder Sonny. In the few interviews he gave over the years, he maintained his innocence, insisted that her comas were caused by her own actions and addictions, and portrayed himself as a victim of a misguided prosecution driven by vindictive stepchildren and overzealous authorities. Klaus von Bülow died in London on May 25, 2019, at age 92, never having faced additional legal consequences for what happened to Sonny. The case divided New York high society and Newport's summer colony in ways that still echo faintly today, decades later. Some believed absolutely that Klaus was guilty, but had been acquitted due to brilliant lawyering, evidentiary technicalities, and the advantage that unlimited money provides in mounting a defense. Others believed, or claimed to believe, that he was genuinely innocent, railroaded by greedy stepchildren and prosecutors who were too eager to convict a wealthy foreign aristocrat. The truth, as is often the case in crimes committed behind the closed doors of the wealthy, remains elusive, hidden behind layers of privilege and legal maneuvering, and the irretrievable loss of the one witness who knew what really happened. What we do know is this. Sonny von Bülow spent 28 years in a coma that began under circumstances suspicious enough to generate 2 criminal trials. Her husband had clear motive and demonstrable opportunity to cause those circumstances, but he was acquitted by a jury that found reasonable doubt in the prosecution's case, aided by defense attorneys who effectively challenged the evidence and presented alternative explanations that the jury found credible. Justice, in the legal sense, was served. Klaus got his day in court, actually 2 days in court, and was ultimately found not guilty by his peers. But justice for Sunny, that's far less clear. She never got to tell her story. Never got to explain what happened on those December nights. Never got to identify who, if anyone, had injected her with the insulin that destroyed her brain and stole 28 years of her life. She lay in that hospital bed for more than a quarter century, breathing but not living, while the world moved on around her. While her children grew into middle age and beyond. While the fortune she'd inherited was spent on her medical care and the legal battles over her fate. While the husband she'd married lived free, whether he was innocent or guilty, in London and later dying peacefully at 92. And on December 6th, 2008, she finally died, taking whatever she knew about December 21st, 1980, with her into whatever comes after this life. The Vanishing of the Real Estate Princess. January 31st, 1982. South Salem, New York. Manhattan. If wealth could protect people from violence, Kathy Durst should have been untouchable. She was married into one of New York's most powerful real estate dynasties, the Durst family, whose name appears on buildings across Manhattan, who literally helped construct the modern skyline, whose tentacles of influence extended from City Hall to Albany to the highest levels of state government. The Dursts weren't just wealthy. They were powerful in ways that most rich people never achieve. The kind of family that could make problems disappear. That could influence investigations with phone calls. That could ensure their names stayed out of headlines when they wanted privacy. That could deploy lawyers like armies when threatened. On a rainy January night in 1982, Kathy Durst vanished. And for nearly 4 decades, the immense wealth and influence of the Durst family seemed to ensure that her disappearance remained exactly what Robert Durst claimed it was. An unsolved mystery with no clear answers and no clear culprit. But the truth, as it eventually emerged through decades of investigation, journalistic persistence, and Robert's own catastrophic mistakes, was far darker than anyone outside the family had imagined. Kathy McCormick met Robert Durst in the early 1970s. She was a dental hygienist, working-class background from Long Island, pretty and vivacious with aspirations beyond the limitations of her birth. Robert was the heir to a real estate fortune, the oldest son of Seymour Durst, who'd built the Durst organization into one of New York's premier real estate development companies, with holdings across Manhattan. The relationship moved quickly, with the intensity of opposites attracting. They married in 1973, when Kathy was 21 and Robert was 30. Kathy found herself thrust suddenly into a world of wealth and privilege she'd never experienced. Penthouses overlooking Central Park. Weekend houses in wealthy Westchester County suburbs. Parties with Manhattan's elite. Access to money that made her previous middle-class life seem like poverty in comparison. But the fairy tale marriage to the real estate heir was actually a descent into nightmare. Robert Durst was not a normal person. Friends and family members would later describe him as odd, emotionally distant, prone to bizarre behavior that ranged from mildly eccentric to genuinely disturbing. He had a history of severe childhood trauma. His mother, Bernice, had committed suicide by jumping from the roof of the family mansion in Scarsdale when Robert was 7 years old, and he'd either witnessed it or found her body shortly afterward, depending on which version of the story you believe. That childhood trauma had clearly damaged something fundamental in Robert's psychological development. He struggled with normal human relationships. He was controlling and paranoid with Kathy. He had a temper that could turn violent without apparent provocation or warning. And there was something cold about him, a fundamental lack of empathy that people who knew him found deeply unsettling. The marriage deteriorated rapidly after the initial romance faded. Robert was physically abusive. Kathy's friends would later testify to seeing bruises on her arms and neck, to her confiding about his violence, about incidents where he'd lost his temper and attacked her. He was emotionally controlling, isolating her from friends and family, monitoring her activities, making her account for every hour she spent away from him. He used his family's wealth and power to intimidate her, making it clear that if she tried to leave, she'd face legal and financial resources she couldn't possibly match. But by 1982, Kathy had decided she'd had enough. She was attending Albert Einstein College of Medicine in the Bronx, working toward becoming a doctor, building toward independence and a career that would allow her to support herself without Robert's money. She was documenting Robert's abuse, keeping records, telling friends about what was happening. She was consulting with lawyers about divorce. She was telling people close to her that she was going to leave him, that she'd finally found the courage to escape despite his threats and his family's intimidating power. On Sunday, January 31st, 1982, Kathy was at the couple's weekend house in South Salem, New York, a wealthy Westchester County community about an hour north of Manhattan. The house sat on several acres of wooded property, isolated from neighbors, the kind of place where you could scream and no one would hear you. It was a miserable night, cold, raining heavily, the kind of penetrating winter rain that chills you to the bone, the kind of weather that makes you want to stay inside by the fire and never go out. According to Robert's account, and this is crucial because Robert was the only living witness to what happened next, Kathy decided she wanted to go back to their Manhattan penthouse that evening. They'd been arguing earlier in the day. The atmosphere in the house was tense. She wanted to leave, to get away from him and the oppressive isolation of the country house. So Robert claimed he drove her to the Katona train station, about 15 minutes from the South Salem house, and dropped her off around 9:30 p.m. He said he waited in the car until he saw the train arrive on the platform. He said Kathy boarded it, heading back to Manhattan and their Riverside Drive penthouse. He said that was the last time he saw her, that she was alive and well when she got on that train. He later elaborated on this story, claiming that a neighbor or doorman at their Manhattan building had seen her at the penthouse later that night, though this sighting was never confirmed by investigators and a supposed witness was never definitively identified. The narrative Robert constructed was simple. He dropped her at the train station. She'd boarded the train to Manhattan. Whatever happened to her happened after she left him. He didn't know where she'd gone. Maybe she'd run away. Maybe she'd met with foul play in the city. Maybe she'd started a new life somewhere under a different identity. He didn't know. He was just as confused and concerned as anyone else who cared about Kathy. Kathy never arrived at the Manhattan penthouse that night. She never showed up for classes at medical school the next morning, something that was completely out of character for her, as she was a dedicated student who rarely missed class. She never contacted friends or family. She never accessed her bank accounts or used her credit cards. She simply vanished from the face of the earth. When people started asking questions, Kathy's friends from medical school, her classmates who wondered where she was, her family who couldn't reach her, Robert's story remained consistent. He dropped her at the train station. She'd boarded the train. He didn't know what happened after that. He was as mystified as everyone else. The missing persons investigation that followed was minimal. Suspiciously, disturbingly minimal, particularly given that a wealthy woman connected to one of New York's most powerful families had vanished without a trace. Then NYPD and Westchester County authorities conducted cursory interviews. They took Robert's statement about dropping Kathy at the train station. They checked hospitals across the metropolitan area. They reviewed transit records looking for any sign of her. They didn't find Kathy, but they also didn't find any concrete evidence of foul play or any reason to seriously suspect Robert beyond the statistical reality that spouses are always the first suspects in disappearances. And then the investigation essentially stopped. Not officially closed, but no longer actively pursued. Kathy was listed as a missing person, her case file sitting in a cabinet somewhere, but no one was actively searching for her. No intensive follow-up investigation. No sustained pressure on Robert to explain inconsistencies in his story or account for his whereabouts. Nothing. Why? The Durst family's influence and their ability to make calls to the right people. Their lawyers, who could deflect investigations before they gained momentum. Their money and political connections, which could ensure that this inconvenient situation didn't become a scandal that damaged the family business or their reputation. Their power to quietly suggest to investigators that pursuing this case too aggressively might not be career-enhancing. For years, for decades, Kathy Durst remained officially missing and presumed dead. Robert went on with his life. He inherited substantial money from his father, Seymour. He continued his involvement in the family business, though his relationship with his brothers, Douglas and Thomas, was increasingly strained over business decisions and his erratic behavior. He remarried eventually to a woman named Deborah Ali Charatan. He lived comfortably on family money, while his first wife's disappearance faded into the background, becoming a cold case that no one was actively investigating. But Kathy's family, particularly her brother Jim McCormack and her friend Gilberte Najami, never stopped believing Robert had killed her. They never stopped pushing. He spent decades contacting authorities, giving interviews to journalists, refusing to let the case die completely, even when it seemed like the Durst family's power would ensure Robert was never held accountable. The case might have remained forever unsolved, might have stayed buried under the weight of Durst family influence, if not for two critical factors: Robert Durst's own catastrophic behavior in subsequent years, and the persistence of investigative journalists who wouldn't let the story die. In December 2000, Susan Berman, Robert's close friend and confidante from college, was murdered in her home in Los Angeles. She was shot execution style in the back of the head, a professional hit. The investigation into her death revealed connections to the Kathy Durst case. Berman had been Robert's alibi for the night Kathy disappeared, had provided statements supporting his version of events, had been his spokesperson to media in the early days of the investigation. Her murder came just as prosecutors in Westchester County were reopening the Kathy Durst investigation with fresh eyes and new forensic techniques. The timing seemed like an awfully convenient elimination of a potential witness who might have been pressured to finally tell the truth about what she knew. Then, in 2001, Robert was arrested in Galveston, Texas, living under a false identity as a mute woman for the murder and dismemberment of his neighbor, Morris Black. The case that emerged was bizarre. Robert claimed he'd killed Black in self-defense during a struggle over a gun, then panicked and dismembered the body, disposing of it in Galveston Bay where parts were found by fishermen. Incredibly, and this speaks to the power of expensive lawyers and reasonable doubt, Robert was acquitted of murder in the Black case, though he did plead guilty to evidence tampering and bail jumping. But the trial revealed a pattern of bizarre, violent behavior that made his claims about Kathy's disappearance seem increasingly implausible. In 2010, filmmaker Andrew Jarecki created All Good Things, a fictionalized but clearly Durst-inspired film about a real estate heir who murders his wife and gets away with it for decades. The film, starring Ryan Gosling and Kirsten Dunst, brought renewed public attention to Kathy's disappearance and the suspicious circumstances around it. And then, in what might be the most catastrophic decision Robert Durst ever made, he agreed to participate in a documentary series with Jarecki. The Jinx, The Life and Deaths of Robert Durst? Why would Robert, who'd successfully evaded prosecution for decades, agree to participate in a documentary that would inevitably examine all the suspicious deaths connected to him? Perhaps arrogance, perhaps a belief that he was smarter than the filmmakers and could control the narrative. Perhaps some unconscious desire to confess, to finally tell the truth after decades of lies. Whatever his reasoning, it was a fatal mistake. The series, which aired on HBO in March 2015, was devastating. Through extensive interviews with Robert, archival footage, and meticulous investigative journalism, it built a compelling case that Robert had murdered Kathy in 1982, had murdered Susan Berman in 2000 to prevent her from revealing what she knew about Kathy's death, and had killed Morris Black in Texas under circumstances far more suspicious than simple self-defense. But the most damning moment came at the very end of the final episode. Robert had been wearing a wireless microphone during his final interview with Jarecki. After the formal interview concluded, Robert excused himself and went to the bathroom. But the microphone was still recording, still transmitting. And what it captured was Robert, apparently talking to himself, saying, "What the hell did I do? Killed them all, of course." The audio was somewhat unclear, and Robert's lawyers would later argue extensively about what he actually said and whether it constituted an actual confession. But millions of viewers heard what sounded unmistakably like Robert admitting to multiple murders. The day before the final episode of The Jinx aired, Robert Durst was arrested in New Orleans and charged with Susan Berman's murder. Prosecutors believed they finally had enough evidence to convict him, and they were determined not to let him escape justice again. The legal proceedings that followed were protracted, delayed by Robert's failing health, by COVID-19 pandemic court closures, by endless defense motions and appeal. But finally, in 2021, the case went to trial in Los Angeles. The prosecution's strategy was to connect three deaths: Kathy's disappearance in 1982, Berman's murder in 2000, and Morris Black's death in 2001. They argued that this was a pattern, that Robert had killed Kathy in a rage at the South Salem house, had dismembered her body and disposed of it in ways that prevented discovery and that Susan Berman had helped him create alibis and false narratives about what happened that night. When prosecutors reopened the Kathy Durst investigation in 2000, they theorized Robert had killed Berman to prevent her from revealing what she knew, either voluntarily to clear her own conscience or under pressure from investigators who could threaten her with charges of being an accessory after the fact. The evidence presented at trial included the killed them all audio from the Jinx, handwriting analysis connecting Robert to an anonymous note sent to police, alerting them to Berman's body, and testimony about the pattern of violence in Robert's relationship. In September 2021, after weeks of testimony and several days of jury deliberation, Robert Durst was convicted of murdering Susan Berman in the first degree. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, but he didn't serve that sentence for long. On January 10, 2022, just 4 months after his conviction, Robert Durst died in custody at a California hospital. The official cause was cardiac arrest complicated by multiple health issues. He was 78 years old. He died never having been formally charged or tried for Kathy's murder, though prosecutors in Westchester County had been building a case and likely would have charged him had he lived longer. And Kathy's body has never been found. Despite searches, despite ground-penetrating radar surveys of the South Salem property, despite dredging of nearby lakes and reservoirs, despite 40 years of investigation, nothing? The prevailing theory among investigators, and those who've studied the case extensively, is that Robert killed Kathy at the South Salem house during an argument on the night of January 31st, 1982. The story about driving her to the train station was a complete fabrication, a timeline he created to establish that she was alive when she left his presence, and that whatever happened to her happened somewhere else. After killing her, possibly striking her in a rage, possibly strangling her, the exact method unknown, he dismembered her body. This is entirely consistent with his later proven pattern in the Morris Black case, where he definitely dismembered a body and disposed of it in pieces. He then disposed of Kathy's remains in ways that have prevented discovery for 40 years. Possibly buried in the woods near the South Salem house, though searches haven't found anything. Possibly weighted and submerged in one of the reservoirs or lakes in northern Westchester County. Possibly, and this is a darker theory, using his family's construction connections to bury body parts at building sites around New York, encasing them in concrete foundations where they'd never be found. The exact method remains unknown, but 4 decades later, despite intensive searches at various times, Kathy's remains have never been recovered. The Durst family's wealth and influence protected Robert for nearly 40 years. Their lawyers deflected investigations before they could gain momentum. Their money ensured that pressure on Robert never became too intense or sustained. Their connections meant that even when people strongly suspected Robert had murdered his wife, the investigation never received the resources or attention needed to build a prosecutable case until it was almost too late. It took extraordinary circumstances, Robert's subsequent murders, the filmmaking of Andrew Jarecki, Robert's own apparent confession on a hot microphone, the persistence of journalists and Kathy's family who refused to let the case die, to finally hold him accountable, and even then, only for Susan Berman's murder, not Kathy's. Kathy Durst was 29 years old when she disappeared. She was just months away from graduating from medical school. She was building a life independent of her abusive husband. She was taking steps to divorce Robert and escape the nightmare her marriage had become when she vanished on that rainy January night. Her family believes she's dead, murdered by Robert, and disposed of in ways that have kept her hidden for 4 decades. Prosecutors believe it. Most people who've followed the case believe it. Robert's own apparent confession on the Jinx suggests it's true. But without a body, without physical evidence, without a confession that could be used in court, Robert was never formally charged with her murder. He died a convicted murderer of Susan Berman, but not of the woman whose death started his decades of violence and evasion. Kathy Durst deserves to be found. Her family deserves to lay her to rest properly. She deserves to be more than just a missing person, more than just the first victim in Robert Durst's killing spree. But for now, she remains where Robert left her on that January night in 1982. Hidden, disappeared, silenced by the wealth and power of the family she married into, buried somewhere under 40 years of secrets and lies. The real estate princess who vanished, whose disappearance was nearly buried forever by the billions of dollars that protected her killer for almost 4 decades. 7 crimes, 1 undeniable truth, Wealth doesn't protect you, it complicates you. The Pierre Hotel thieves walked in wearing tuxedos and walked out millionaires. Tommy Gilbert pulled a trigger over pocket change he didn't need. Rod Kovlin staged a bathtub death on the year's loudest night. Serge Rubinstein collected enemies like some collect art, until one finally cashed in. Gigi Jordan poisoned her son in a suite that cost more than most people's cars. Sunny Von Bülow spent 28 years asleep while the world argued over her husband's guilt. And Kathy Durst disappeared into a January night, buried by billions. Notice what didn't save any of them: the addresses, the lawyers, the security systems, the social standing, the family names that open doors and close investigations. Money bought better crime scenes, better staging, better delays. But it didn't stop the bullets, the strangulation, the insulin, the disappearance. And here's what nobody tells you about these cases. They're not aberrations. They're not exceptions that prove the rule. They're the rule itself, just better hidden. For every Gilbert or Durst that makes headlines, there are a dozen more that don't. Wealth buys privacy, and privacy is where violence breeds. The real question isn't whether justice was served. It's whether justice is even possible when one side has infinite resources and the other is already dead. If stories like these matter to you, subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a case. This has been Plain Sight Docs, proving that money can't protect you, but it can buy you 40 years before anyone figures out you're a killer.